hands and get started, and we'll let you know if we get them back.
Okay, so I'm going to switch the camera over to Jon, and he's going to tell us all about this town.
Okay, so we're in the Plains right now. We're right off Johnson Road at Jackson Drive, which turns into First Street up in the Plains. And we're on the second floor of the Eclipse Company Store. That is a big building that you can see from Route 33. It was originally a coal company store that sold mining goods and groceries and things for the miners who lived in this area and mined the coal of the mine right here underneath the store, underneath Route 33, and underneath a good part of the Plains. The company store was built in 1901, and at that time there was a coal mine about 400 feet down below us called Eclipse Mine Number 4, and it had an entrance that's near where the bike path is now in the Plains. And it also had what's called a tipple entrance over on River Road on the other side of Route 33. Around the company store are little white houses that are all about the same size. Those are company houses. And what I mean by that is that the coal company that owned the mine and employed the miners also built housing for the miners and ran the store. So the people lived near where they worked and they bought their things from the company store. Right next to us is also a railroad that still has trains come through 3 times a day carrying coal. And that's a good amount of the coal from this mine was carried from this region by rail. Also right near us is some of the remnants or pieces of the old canal that went from Athens all the way up through Ohio and down to the Ohio River. You can see a little bit of that in Nelsonville, but you can also see it right from the bike path near Eclipse Company Town. That's because at the turn of the last century, this was a really busy industrial area where there was lots of coal being mined, there was lots of timber being made into lumber. There were big brick yards in this area that made bricks to make all the buildings here, but also shipped all over the country. There was also a lot of tile made here, and another town built by a company north of us, north of Nelsonville, is called Haydenville. If you ever drive through Haydenville, almost to Logan, you can see all these different houses that are made out of glazed tile, which is a pretty interesting thing to look at as well. But for this building and for this company town, there were 2 brothers named the Johnson brothers. For those of you familiar with the Plains, Johnson Road is a big road right near us that goes right past Athens High School and into the Plains. That was named after the Johnson brothers, who started the mine here. The mine continued until 1948, and then it closed. And this company store building was used as a barn. It was used as a machine shop. It stored antiques for a while. It was an American Legion Hall where there used to be dances and parties here in the 1950s. And then it came back, and we were able to restore it and turn it into the use now as a Eclipse Company Store restaurant, which is located here. Along with the company store itself, there are 14 buildings, which are the company houses that were in this area. 7 of those are original to here, 8 of them really, and then the rest of them we saved and moved here from other parts of the Plains. There's also one of the houses has a basement with huge thick stone walls that we discovered was where the mine stored their dynamite for use in the mine. The coal came out of the mine, a lot of it on little carts, that a miner would fill a cart that was on railroad tracks. And then those carts were pulled out of the mine by ponies or donkeys or even teams of dogs that would work like dogs with a dog sled to bring the coal out of the mine. The miners then would be paid for the amount of coal that they were able to mine each day. And that coal was was both used here and shipped all over to other places. The coal company houses and just like the store were all built between 1900 and 1901. So that makes them about 120 years old now. This is the last company store that's still standing in Ohio, surrounded by company houses. There were other company towns around our area, many of them, but many of those have fallen into disrepair or don't any longer have a company store that's still standing. So the United States Department of the Interior recognized it, along with the Ohio Historic Society, that this was a special site, that this was a coal mine heritage site. And so this is now known as a National Historic District, having to do with the Eclipse Mine number 4 and the people who lived here and the remaining architecture of the company store and the company houses. When the miners would finish their work week, they would come to the company store to be paid their week's wages. Much of those wages probably went right back to the company store to buy the things they needed for their families. And we have some pictures here that we can show you of what the company store looked like that we're in right now before we started fixing up. This is one view. Here's another view, and you can tell that it was in pretty rough shape at the time we started to work on restoring it. The original coal tipple, as it's called, is across Route 33. It's no longer there, but this is what it looked like. And that was like an elevator shaft that went down into the mine to take the miners down and to bring the miners and coal back up by one means, the other one being those dog sleds and donkey carts that were pulled. And then you can see in some of the other pictures, this house right here is called a shotgun house. That's a particular style of house that's long like a rectangle, but most of the houses are what they call 4 square houses, and you can see examples of them. By 4 square, I mean that there were, it was like a box with a wall front to back, side to side, 4 rooms that were all exactly the same size.
And these are the houses the miners lived in?
They lived in the houses. Now the houses, some of the houses are lived in by people and others are businesses. None of the houses had any plumbing, so that there was a hand crank well that people used to get their water, no bathrooms inside. All of the units had outhouses in the backyard. Even when we started to work on this project in 1997, one of the houses still had an outhouse because the lady that lived there she was 86 years old. She'd lived there for 35 years, and she didn't want anything to do with indoor plumbing or a toilet. She much preferred to use her outhouse. But this was part of many coal mines in this region. And we are part of a group called Little Cities of Black Diamonds, which is a coal mine heritage group that works to preserve the history and to tell the stories of the time when coal mining was probably the biggest source of employment or jobs in this area. This area being Athens County, Meigs County, Morgan County, Perry County, Hocking County. And many of those sites still have museums and places that you can tour and visit. In the late 1800s, this was one of the busiest coal mining areas anywhere in the world. And it's also where some of the beginnings of the United Mine Workers and other unions to protect workers' rights were first struggled over and fought and won in this area, as well as safety rights for miners that continue to be a struggle, but many of the first efforts and wins at having workers' rights be honored happened right here in our area. The little town that we now call the Eclipse Company town, it was referred to on some early maps as Hocking. And that's a popular word that so many things are referred to. You know, not only the Hocking River, but even the Johnson brothers ended up selling their coal company, their ownership of this coal company, to the Hocking Valley Coal Company. And they're the ones that operated it through the 1920s. In the 1930s, during the Depression, the coal company shut down and the miners were laid off, just like people are being laid off right now for various reasons having to do with the COVID. They were laid off at that time, but then when the United States entered World War II, they needed energy, they needed coal, and the mine started back up again. And that mine then ran all through the 40s and closed permanently, as I said earlier, in 1948. So one of the things we had here, along with the houses that are here, there used to be 14 of these company houses up by Rural Actions headquarters and the Lindley Inn, which is a assisted living facility on the other side of Johnson Road. There used to be 2 houses right at the junction of Johnson Road and Route 33. And those have all been, are gone now. Some of those are the ones that we moved down here to save and restore. And there was also a little area right next to us that had 5 houses right under what's right now, right under the bridge that the bike path goes under Route 33. It was called 5 Spot. And 5 Spot was just this spot that had 5 of the coal mining houses that were located there. We're right next to a big cornfield that I have been told by people in the area that it used to be the site of 3 Native American different villages where years ago many different stone artifacts and arrowheads and things were found in that cornfield, that this was a popular place for people to live you know, back many centuries.
Mm-hmm.
For the buildings, go ahead.
Sorry, I wonder, and maybe we can do this in a little bit if you want to stay inside, John, and just Madison can do it, but would it be possible to go step outside so that we can see some of the spots that you're talking about, some of the houses or the cornfield or any of that?
You can look out the window right now at the railroad and the cornfield where the native villages were. You can see the bike path from there and the rail crossing.
So if you look past the cars, the first thing you see is the bike path.
Green grass.
Yes, green grass. So the bike path, some green grass, the railroad tracks, and then the cornfield that John was talking about. So that railroad, or I'm sorry, the bike path is called the Hocking Adena bike path. And that name comes from the indigenous people that probably lived right there in that cornfield, which is kind of cool. And that railroad track is the same railroad track that John is talking about that brought coal to all throughout America, it seems like. And a lot of it got its start here, and it still does today, but maybe not as much.
Then if we look out another window here, we can see houses.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, here's the houses that we've been talking about.
So you see the roof lines of the houses. Each of the houses have slate roofs, which in an unusual size. But those are all original to each of the homes.
Oh, wow.
As well as the company store above us. And any of you ever pick up a piece of slate, you'll see how heavy they are. That was another form of mining. Slate mining was really popular 100 years ago for the roofing for homes, and that's what is at all of these places. So you can see one row there. You can see one of the other houses that's fixed up. And all the houses have been restored now and are being, have people staying in them.
So people live in these houses now?
Yes, in about half, and then there are businesses in some of the other houses.
One of our participants, Melissa, said in the chat that she remembers these houses from when she was little because her dad grew up down the road and her grandfather worked in the mine, and she was really amazed to see how the store had been restored when she visited.
Oh, that's neat.
It's a really beautiful place now.
So right now in the company store, if you Google Eclipse Company Store, you will see that it's a restaurant and that it's open and has takeout, and people come here to buy barbecue and other food. There's also a website, Eclipse Company Town, www.eclipsecompanytown.com, and that website has some more photographs, and it has a lot more about the history of the town. I also mentioned Little Cities of Black Diamond, and that's another website you can go to find a lot more information about coal mine heritage in our region. That name, Little Cities of Black Diamond, comes from a famous book written by a local historian. And by Little Cities, by Black Diamonds, they mean the black diamond is another word for coal. Coal was so valuable and created so many jobs, but it also created not only little company towns like Eclipse, but also some towns that grew up into much larger towns, or ones that are starting to fade away now, but were once much, much larger in Hocking and Perry County, and as well as down our way. Some of them even have names associated with coal mining, Coal Run, Carbon Hill, Carbonville, and it's just really interesting to see how a once dominant industry in our area still has historical roots, and people just like the grandparent we just heard about, who have connections to the mine. One of the most famous mines in our area is the Millfield Mine, which is north of Athens, north of Chansey's, south of Gloucester. And that became famous because it had an explosion and a tragedy where a lot of miners lost their lives. Tragedies like that often are covered in the newspapers. There's been a group that's preserved and honored the lives of the people that lost their lives in that mine explosion. But that's another historic site that has to do with coal mine heritage in our region.
We've gotten a question, what makes a company town a company town?
So it's called a company town when the company that employed the people in their jobs, like the coal company here employing the miners, also builds the town, also builds the company store and each of the houses, rents the houses to the workers, and then has places available for the workers to be able to buy food and clothing and things they need. So the workers here, when this mine opened, there weren't automobiles, so it would be a long way to walk to Athens or to Nelsonville, or there were people used horses, but the miners, the company would build the houses so that the miners would be right near their jobs to be able to go to work. And they would open the company stores to be able to have things for the miners so that they didn't have to travel by horseback or walk or take a train to go to another town to be able to buy things that they needed. So that's where the company town comes from, the idea that the company you work for also owns the town. And there are some big company towns, like I mentioned, Haydenville, much bigger than this, that you can drive through right off Route 33 just south of Logan, with some really interesting houses. And since they made tile there, all of the houses are made out of tile, and but those were all built by the company. And there are even bigger company towns that still exist, like down by, there's some big ones in West Virginia that were built by lumber companies or timber companies, and they weren't coal company towns, they were timber or wood company towns that wanted to be able to house their workers out right in the mountains where they were cutting the timber. The most famous one of those is called Cass. And if you look up or Google Cass, West Virginia, CASS, you'll see some amazing homes that have been preserved there, and a big company store in West Virginia. That's right by the Snowshoe Ski Resort down in Pocahontas County in West Virginia. But that's another good example of a company town.
I've heard before that some company towns made up their own currency. Have you heard of that before?
Yes. Some company towns, or some coal companies would pay their workers in what looks like monopoly money. It would be like fake dollar bills. And they would refer to those as script, SCRIPT. And that would be like a coupon that would pay you instead of in dollars, in company script that could only be used by turning it back into the company store instead of money. And that was one way that the company towns kept everything in-house and didn't even turn it into money to pay the workers, to pay back to them for many of the goods they needed. But coal miners would have to buy their own outfits and clothing and gloves, but they would also need to buy their hats and the little lamps that they wore on their hats to be able to see down in the mine, and their shovels and their picks to be able to mine the coal. And so all those would be for sale at the company store as well. Eclipse, as far as we know, did not have script. Instead, they did use cash that they paid. In fact, the pay station for the mine was right at the company store. And if there was ever script used here, we've never been able to find it. We also have never been able to find a picture of the company store when it was stocked with goods and the mine was open. That would be really cool to see what that was like.
That would be cool.
But we haven't been able to find one of those.
So we should move on to Paul soon, but I wanted to give people a chance to ask any questions that they might have, or also maybe to share any stories if anyone here has family or knows other things who worked in the coal mines. Does anyone have any questions or stories about their own family members who worked in the mines? I was wondering, you mentioned that the tipple was really nearby too, which is where the coal like came up from underground to get loaded onto the train. Where, if I was in Eclipse now and I tried to imagine where that used to be, where would it have been?
On Route 33 by Johnson Road, coming to Eclipse. If instead of turning onto Johnson Road into the plains, you instead turned off Route 33 onto River Road, which runs along the bike path, about a half-mile down River Road, you will see some glazed tile, one-story buildings. Those are the old wash house and a warehouse from the mine, and the tipple was right there. So the tipples no longer exists, but it was right along River Road, right next to where the still standing wash house and warehouse are. And you can tell that they're from the mine because they have dark brown glazed tile, not bricks, but tiles that are the sides of each of those buildings. And that was right where the tipple was.
Cool, thank you. I can imagine that. So if I'm in Eclipse, it's on the other side of 33 going up the bike path.
Right.
Anyone else? Melissa says that she doesn't know much, but her dad used to be able to see the glow of the coal mine at night from the house up the hill. That's kind of cool. I didn't realize they would say it up like that.
I bet the tipple was lit up at night, you know, and that maybe that was where the glow was from. And they probably worked 3 shifts, because when you're down in the mine anyway, you don't have to wait for daylight, since there's no light down there. They would remove about 50% of the coal and leave the other 50% in to keep the surface from sinking. And that has carried on now for 120 years, where we don't really have any places that that we're aware of where the ground has sunk because of the hollow places underneath us for where the coal was taken out.
So are there holes in this ground underneath us now, you think, from where it was mined?
Oh yeah, at least half. It looks like a honeycomb of the parts they leave, they call them pillars. And the pillars hold up the surface, protect the miners, but also protect the surface from falling. But about an equal amount of the size of those pillars is just the big holes or the missing place where the coal was taken out. About 5 feet thick of coal with other things in it that needed to be sorted out. But it was a very big vein of coal that was not very far below ground back at that time, which would have been before they had electric or diesel power to be able to pull them, to do the mining or to pull the coal out of the mine.
Yeah, the dogs had to do it. Well, I probably have 100 questions I could sit here and ask Jon, but if it's time to switch, should we do that now, or?
I think Nate and Paul are ready if you guys are done.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jon. That was really, really interesting. We have such a rich coal mining history right where we all live, and it's really cool to hear about it.
Thanks for being interested.
All right,
Yeah, it's fun
so
to walk around and imagine how it used to look. Sorry, go ahead, Danny.
I was just gonna segue over to Nate and Paul. Whenever you guys are ready, take it away.
Hey y'all, we're back. We had some technical difficulties with the heat of the sun and our phone out here, but we're back with a new system, and we should be ready to talk to you now. But when did we cut out? Did we get to talk to you at all, or was it almost immediately?
Pretty much immediately.
All right, we'll start from the beginning then. Well, this is Paul Patton from the Social Enterprise at Rural Action, and he's here to tell us about a different site here in the Plains that has to do with people that were here long before anybody was pulling coal out. Go ahead, Paul.
All right. Well, Thanks, guys, and sorry about the issues we had before. We are here in the plains. It's hard to see from the angle we're at right now, but this is the door to Mound. We'll walk around the side of it here so you get a better idea. This was built about 2,000 years ago by the first peoples that lived here in the Hocking Valley. The Hocking Valley really became inhabited by humans probably somewhere around 15,000 years ago. We're learning more and more about when people first came to the New World, so it could have been even earlier than that. But our best estimate is about 15,000 years ago, people were living in the Appalachian region of the United States. Like I said, this got built at about 2,000 years ago, so there's a lot of history in between when people got here and when mounds started being constructed. We'll talk a little bit briefly about terms like Adena and Hopewell and what those words mean. But I want to focus on what we call that first period when people got here. During the Ice Age, we call those the people that were alive then Paleo-Indians. They made large spear points that they would put on the end of sticks. They probably hunted elk, deer. There was a lot of elk here in this region. Suggestion maybe that they hunted larger megafauna, huge animals as well. But for the most part, they were foragers. They were hunters. They were gatherers. They looked for deer. They ate a lot of deer, probably elk. They probably ate a lot of arboreal nuts like hickory and walnut and acorns. And some of the fruits that are around here, like pawpaws, for example, persimmons, cherries, native plum species. So this really was a smorgasbord of food all over. And for the majority of time, people that lived here hunted and gathered until about 4,000 years ago. Something happens around 4,000 years ago. The populations begin to increase. And what we see is that people began domesticating plants. What that means is they took wild plant species and they put them in gardens. And over time, they selected for different characteristics that would pop up amongst those plants. Like, for example, the sunflower. They selected for larger seeds in the sunflower. Natural variation in seed size, and they continued to then breed those plants until they created essentially a whole new species that's very different from its wild ancestor, what we call its progenitor.
Wow.
And so the primary ones here that most people, when we think about native peoples that lived here, they think a lot about corn, squash, right, beans.
Yeah.
All of those plants didn't come in until about 1,000 years ago. But they started domesticating plants 4,000 years ago. So what they were domesticating, often cases, what you probably pull out of your gardens today and call weeds, right? Squash, of course, was an early domesticate, but then they had things like goosefoot. They had things, marsh elder, maygrass, erect knotweed. Many of these plants you probably have never heard of unless to buy herbicide to kill them anymore. But this was the primary diet of the people that lived here then for about 3,000 years, supplemented by the deer, supplemented by hickory nuts and acorns and fruits. But they were actually practicing a form of agriculture, essentially, with native plants, what we would call native weeds. And the mounds, let's take a walk around the side of North here. The mounds here in the plains, at one point there were 33 of them. We're left with a small handful of them today. Most of them were destroyed early on. We call these mounds, they're often called late Adena or Hopewell mounds. What do those words mean? Well, we don't really know what the people that lived here called themselves during this time period, but we start to see cultural markers that we associate with Adena about 2,500 years ago or so. And here in the Hocking Valley, it starts by them going to the ridge tops that are all around us, and they start building small mounds on top of those ridges. This is a larger mound that comes later in time, probably about 2,000 years ago. So about a 500-year difference between when they first started building and when we get to this. And I want to walk us around here so that you can kind of see the outline of this.
And Paul, how do we know this information? How are you discovering these kinds of things, like what people ate and
Sure.
Any of this?
Yeah, so plant material is interesting, right? And preservation is interesting. Archaeologists excavate sites. We try for the most part to stay away from excavating these sites, like the mounds, because this mound has people interred in it. There are family members of the people that lived here buried inside this mound. Mounds oftentimes have multiple burials in them. Those that have been excavated or retrenched early on. This one would have been much larger, but it's been plowed down by agricultural practices over the last 100 years. So we're left with a smaller mound here than what probably stood here. But a lot of the food material
Could you stop a second and give us a good long look at the mound? It's kind of hard to see on the phone how it's not quite just even a field.
Yeah, so take a look over here, like towards the road and these houses. And then as we pan like back up towards Johnson Road, you can kind of see on the right side of the screen there how the green stuff, you know, starts to overtake what you would see in the houses. And it's not huge, but there's a definite mound shape here, and it's, I mean, there wouldn't just normally be a hill here. This is definitely something that was put here on purpose.
Right. And as I said, there were 33 of these here, and we're left with a handful. But inside of that are bodies that were buried thousands of years ago by people. And what we know about how they built these mounds is there would be an initial burial. There, in many cases, is a prepared floor made of clay. They would bring in logs, and they would actually build a small building, and they would put the body inside of it.
Wow.
That then oftentimes would get burnt or would collapse, and then a layer of dirt would be brought in over top of it. And what the few mounds here that were excavated really well by archaeologists and documented, what we found is that there's an initial layer of dirt that's added on, and then some time passes, and people come back to the location, and they burn the surface of it, and they take and dig little pits, and then they burn food offerings in those, and then they put another layer of dirt on top of it. And this would have gone on for years and years and years. And this then makes these mounds larger and larger. Occasionally then another body will be placed inside of it. Those little tiny pits where they burn food offerings, you know, there's a mound that was excavated not very far from here, just a few roads over. And what we found was that in those pits were broken bones of deer, fresh killed deer. So these may have been, perhaps they gathered at this location, had a dinner to remember the person or to celebrate the person, and then they buried the remaining waste of that or food into the mound as kind of a symbolic gesture. Food being something that really does unite us in terms of our ceremony and practices as humans, regardless of our culture. When it comes to understanding the changes in diet that occurred over time, most of that information actually comes from habitation sites. Like John had mentioned, there were some habitation sites down in the floodplain villages down below Eclipse. Those sites, when we there's the leftover of campfires in them. There's the remains of houses in them. Well, what does a house look like for people like this? These would have been wooden structures that then they would have made a mix of clay and what we call wattle and daub houses, and they packed that in. And so the posts where they dig out to put those poles in to build the house, oftentimes would burn, oftentimes would preserve. They leave a discoloration in the soil, and you can actually detect that when you're excavating a site. The fire pits, the cooking pits, the storage pits, all of those things have materials that preserve in them. And in the case that there is burning, the great thing about burning is that it preserves just about everything that's a hard material. So seeds will burn and carbonize, and those will be preserved. And so archaeologists can go back and dig up those pits and run them through water and small sieves and collect all these tiny seed fragments and nutshell fragments and bone fragments. And under a microscope, we'll go through and look and divide those out and identify what plants we're seeing, what materials were being consumed. Occasionally you get lucky and you find broken pots that have material on the inside of it, and you can actually see some of the seeds charred in there and preserved that would have made up their diet, their dinner. And then we also can look at real tiny fragments. Believe it or not, plants leave behind tiny residues, starches, something called a phytolith, These sometimes preserve, and some of those you can figure out what species you're looking at based upon those under high-powered microscopes. And so archaeologists have been working to do that as well, so that they can actually unveil what kind of food was being produced and by who, and what some of the diet was for people in the distant past. So that's where a lot of that kind of information comes from.
Awesome. So when you talk about habitation sites, is that everything that you talked about? You know, like food, homes, you know, kind of these burial sites, or what would you define a habitation site as?
Habitation sites are usually where people live for a good period of the year.
Okay.
Now, when people were hunter-gatherers and foragers, they were spending a little less time at necessarily one location. They were moving around on the landscape more frequently.
Gotcha.
Okay. At about that time where we start to see them domesticating native plants, about 4,000 years ago, we also start to see them transitioning to building more long-term structures. Okay, so the houses become bigger, they become rectangular instead of circular. The initial homes that we see, people were building circular houses, kind of like think of moving from a tent to a cabin, right?
Okay.
Kind of transition in a way, something that's more temporary, something that's more permanent. So at that time where they start farming, it's about the same time we see them settling down on the landscape. It's also gets close to that time where we start to see those mounds being built up on top of ridges.
Okay.
Okay, so, and what's really interesting, if you think about it this way, for every mound, and if you go through the Hocking Valley, every ridgetop probably had a mound on top of it, or almost every ridgetop had a mound or two up there. And down below there is a terrace that sits along the floodplain. Those habitation sites would be down there on those terraces. And so you buried your relatives that have passed away on the ridge above where your village is, essentially.
Right.
And that floodplain is where your gardens would be. And you would be using the nutritious soils of the river basin and the floodplain to grow food for your family. And so we can kind of map this model of communities across the landscape. And then somewhere around 2,000 years ago, there's another kind of shift that happens. And that is, we don't see the ridgetop mounds being built anymore. They start building these mounds here at this location. And so some of our understanding of this is to say that people have kind of changed the way they're doing things. Whereas you had each of these little independent villages and communities, but about 2,000 years ago, they start coming together more and start building their mounds here and probably bringing their dead. So this shows kind of a wider mindset of identity, right? So think of your small household, your family, and then people begin to identify more as a larger network of households and communities, a tribe, so to speak. And so this location here in the plains, with all of these mounds, was basically a location where people probably gathered every year or every couple of years to partake in ceremonies, marriages, to exchange knowledge. They probably had festivals. What's interesting is that no one lived here in the plains on the flat area. It was reserved for these monuments, these earthworks. So there was no one person who could claim ownership over this. It's kind of like, in a sense, the county fair, right?
Okay.
The place where everyone
Yeah.
comes together to celebrate harvests and festivals. They bury their dead together. It has important ceremonial value to the community. And we see these in different areas. If we go over to the Scioto Valley, just one river valley over from here, familiar with all the Hopewell mound groups, right? And all of the earthworks throughout that river valley. Whereas we have this one big one here in the Hocking Valley, there's a dozen of them, of these earthwork complexes along the main river of the Scioto there around Chillicothe. Those we refer to as Hopewell. Again, Hopewell was the farmer's name where that first one came from. That wasn't what they called themselves. But so they're doing something very similar there. And again, those areas, those mound centers, no one's living in them. Their communities are all spread out around the mound center. And so all of those smaller towns or villages and communities would have seen the mound center as their central location that they came to partake in, celebrations and ceremonies and probably religious ceremonies as well.
Awesome. So the rest of the mounds in this area, are they all kind of right around here? And what's happened to them? Why don't we just see them?
So a lot of the mounds that are here were destroyed by agriculture initially, plowing fields, continuing to plow over them. Some of them were destroyed by people that we call looters. Back then, they would have called them antiquarians. They were collectors of materials, and so they would drive through these mounds with force-pulled trenchers and rip out everything they could from the mound to try to keep it or sell it. There's stories actually from here in the plains of one of the mounds not far from here that was destroyed and no longer exists, where they said it was pulled through and they found the skeleton of a woman, and she was wearing a dress made out of deer hide that had preserved and copper beading. There was copper fringe on it. And the story, the account that's written down says that the crowd was so excited they all wanted a piece of the dress, and they ripped it into pieces and split them up amongst the people. Many of the skeletons of the people that were exhumed were just tossed away. Sometimes those would be collected and people would keep them in boxes. Sometimes they got shipped to museums. Archaeologists today, of course, recognize that that's not a good thing to do and it's ethically irresponsible. So they worked hard with existing First Peoples tribes, Native American tribes today, to try to do what we call repatriating. That is to say that if we can find that there is a tribe that's affiliated with this land that we're on and where these bodies have been exhumed through archaeological excavation today, they try to give them to that tribe for special burial. And I know there are a few tribes working here in the Hocking Valley area to procure a location where they can inter the people who were dug up here in the past and put those bodies back in the ground. And show them honor and respect. Okay. So that's been an ongoing conversation amongst archaeologists, because ultimately when you excavate these sites, sometimes you're going to find people. And these were human beings that lived lives not all that different from us, maybe not the same technology we had, but the same struggles, the same emotions, the same desires of growing and taking care of their families. And so we have to honor their remains, but also I think it's an important part of our landscape to honor these monuments that were so sacred to them, that are still here and part of what it is to live in Appalachia today, and recognize the impact that they had on our environment and how we are beneficiaries of much of what they did. A lot of what we know now, when we reconstruct the forest profiles, when we look at what types of trees, it does appear that many Native Americans, the first peoples of this area, were actively engaged in forest management. Wow. So a lot of the oak and hickory species that we think of as dominating our forests today, there's good archaeological evidence that suggests that Native peoples worked to increase the populations of those trees in particular, and maybe cut out other species of trees that hampered the growth of oaks and hickories. A lot of the fruits that are available, pawpaws, for example, most likely in some way or another were being encouraged by the first peoples in this area. The raspberries, the sumacs, all of these plants that we're familiar with today, a lot of it is probably here in the quantities it is because of management by people that were here in the past.
You spoke about some of the tribes who are looking for a place here in the Hocking River Valley to do something with these things that we're finding. What are some of those tribes?
So I know that the Eastern Shawnee and the Shawnee
Unfortunately, seems like we're losing Paul Nate a little again. I hear you starting to talk about the Shawnee.
I think you're right, Darcy. Hopefully his phone isn't overheating again. But does anyone have any questions?
I wanted to ask them if they could see any of the plants around them. They were talking about so many different plants that were useful to people.
Mm-hmm.
But we might not be able to ask them.
Uh-oh. I didn't know. Susan is asking, is this mound accessible to just anyone, or is it on private property? I'm not sure the answer to that one.
So I don't know if the mound is technically on private property or not, but there's 2 mounds in the plains, and they are all, they're both like visible and accessible from the road, and you can see, it looks like at this one that there's like a little path going up to it that I think anyone can.
Hey,
walk
we're
up.
back. If you'd like to have us, we got a 2-phone system going now.
Sweet.
Fun,
Well, we just have a second or two. I think you lost you when you were just trying to talk about the Shawnee, if you want to summarize that up quickly. And then we also had a question about whether the mound is accessible to anyone who wants to see it, or if it's private property.
So this mound in particular, the Door 2 mound, is actually owned by the Archaeological Conservancy. They purchased it to preserve it in perpetuity. So there is a path that cuts up to it. I believe this path actually goes over to the bike path. So you can kind of walk this mode path off to see this one in particular.
Right off First Street here.
Right off of First Street. There's a cute little housing complexes here, and a road a path that kind of comes up around it that'll lead you over to the bike path. With respect to what I was mentioning with some of the tribal nations, I think there's a lot of conversation around this, and if you're interested, there's a lot of law related to this, and a lot of court filings, and then a lot of archaeologists working to try to be better stewards of the land and the remains of the people that were here before us. And so a lot of tribes have been working to try to find a place where they can inter the remains that were excavated in the past, and give them safe burial where they won't be disturbed in the future. And so it's just one example of some of the tribes that I know have been working here with the Forest Service to try to find a location for materials that came from this area.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul.
Paul, is there...
So if you want to visit the plains on First Street, sorry, go ahead, Danny.
I was just wondering if there's any like website resource you had in mind that we could share with people who wanted to learn more about this.
Sure, there's a lot of great resources out there. Unfortunately, like with respect to this area and the plains itself, I don't know of any real wonderful, just one website resource. There's a book that was published many years ago, called The Emergence of the Mound Builders. And there's a chapter in there devoted solely to the plains and shows the map of where all the mounds once were, pictures of them throughout history, and then kind of lays out the ones that have been excavated, what were found from them. That's a great resource if you're interested in that. And I know our local libraries have that book. There's a lot of tribal web pages as well that you could go to for different tribal nations if you're interested in learning more about their culture and some of the, as it functions today, and then also in the past. And then also, of course, the Ohio History connection. In Columbus, their webpage, they oftentimes have a lot of information dedicated there to the first peoples throughout the state of Ohio, and so you can learn more at that site.
Awesome.
Any other questions or?
Well, I think we have to finish up because there's another meeting scheduled on here. But if anyone does think of other questions or topics they want to hear about next week, I think if everything works out, I can't guarantee, we're supposed to do a field trip on Appalachian music. And thank you all so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, John, if you're still around. And we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good one.
Well, I will keep in mind and let you know if I can